And tonight's tale. Darkness isn't the only thing that hides secrets. The silence cannot be trusted either. If art is how we decorate space, then music is how we decorate time. It stills the mind from the most intricate of thoughts, or pushes the body to a fluid state of motion. It can sweep one with the most profound of expressions and add light and levity to any room if it so wishes. Yet, there is a sinister subtext to the melodies and harmonies that can thrust the soul into an endless cacophony of chords from which they are helpless to escape, finding solace and rest only in that quiet moment, that brief respite of time and space, where the final note at last fades, its memory shimmering in the air for the faintest of breaths before the first note begins again in earnest. It is in this moment of silence and stillness where I now find the only peace left to me. But I am not alone. There are others, a countless moratorium swirling within this nothing more than an extended protraction that whisper and quiver with the acrid smoke of dark deeds and foul intentions, palpable as the scent of a storm on the horizon as they wait, swelling with anticipation for the crash of that first fatal note. If art is how we decorate space, then music is how we decorate time, my father had said when I was very young. I had been no more than perhaps 4 or 5 at a time, seated upon his knee in the music room of the house that I had not seen since, except in my dreams. Like most little girls, I looked up to my father with the shining eyes of trust and faith and adoration. And so I eagerly committed myself to the course that he had laid out for me, filled with a sense of eagerness at the opportunity to make him proud of me. It is the only memory of him that I have. Shortly after this memory, I suppose, it could not have been more than a handful of days, a week at most, and I found myself in a carriage, watching as the gates disappeared behind me, bound for the ferry that would whisk me off to the boarding school that was to shape my life, accompanied by the prim and proper and somewhat imposing rectress of the academy. She was a severe-looking woman. Her dark hair was just beginning to grey, so the black and light strands swirled together in a churning sea as they curled and were swept to the back of her head and pinned with a silver piece that featured a pair of masks which marked the theatre. Her lips were thin enough as to give her a constant look of parsing them, though perhaps that was just simply the expression that she always wore. She sat with a rimrod straight back, her neck held high, and face more like a mask of porcelain than a canvas of expression, on the opposing side of the carriage from myself, her cold, light eyes looking down upon me as I sat on my knee, looking out of the window as my home was swallowed slowly by the distance. Come now, Veronescence. It's time to stop acting like a child. turn around and sit properly at once," she said, her voice shrill and disapproving. I turned and sunk down into the seat, my feet pushing out in front of me for underneath the frilly pink hem of my dress to dangle in the air over the edge of the seat as I sulked.
"But I am a child,"
I responded petulantly.
"And my name is Viri."
The rectress was not a woman I was used to, or would tolerate such insolence as this, a fact which I learned soon enough. Nor was she the forgiving sort of woman, which I learned equally as quickly. My father had secured me a place at the Senest Institute, an exclusive finishing school and academy for the arts, and the rectress had come personally to collect me from our estate and assume control at once. I had never been an especially difficult child, though throughout my years at the Institute, I had become increasingly willful in my resistance to the strict rules and the stricter rectors. Though I suppose that such elite academies are quite adept at handling such situations, as the rectress certainly was. And it was not long before I realised the error of my ways and began, in earnest, to achieve the exacting perfection expected from a student of the arts. Perhaps one might suppose the change was brought about by the many nights of missed meals in recompense for my misbehaviours, though the more astute would surmise it was the letters received that one blustery night in June. I had, for the first few years of my study at the Institute, made acquaintances that formed swiftly into friendships in the manner in which only a child is capable, while two of the other pupils. Leticia was the first daughter of a wealthy businessman, her father owning a fleet of merchant ships that predominantly served to ferry silks and spices from the Orient. Pavati, the second daughter of a prince in India, was the polar opposite of Leticia. Where Leticia had golden blonde locks that sprung into excitable curls around her head, Pavati had long, sleek hair that fell about her shoulders in a sheet of shimmering black silk. Where Leticia had bright blue eyes that shone in the sunlight during our mid-morning walks, in two single files behind the rectors through the square and around the fountain. Pavati's almond-shaped eyes were rich and warm like melted chocolate, and glinted knowingly in the candlelight in the evenings as we sat around the fireplace, our attentions meant to be focused on our needleworks. My father was a renowned violinist of good breeding, and my quick smile and mischievous nature quickly endeared me to my fellow schoolmates. As I said, we became fast friends, which grew only more intimate as we aged, and grew together under the ever-watchful eye of the rectress, taking meals, lessons, and merits for our misbehaviour side by side. It would be hard, I suppose, not to assume that one might naturally develop such affection of friendship for one confidant over the other, as is wont to happen often enough when one matures and find responsibilities require far more attention from one. Though I was a carefree child, with little to worry after save for the wrath of the rectress, and both of these childhood friends held equal place in my breast. As is a wont of children of a certain age, there hardly came a week that would pass by without incident for rebuke, as we three sought to rebel, each striving in turn to best the last and the extremity of occurrence, before the rectress was made aware of our mischief, for which, naturally, punishment was swiftly dispatched. But what is punishment to a child of means in a world where only the affections of her peers made a stirring upon her heart or mind? What matters to a girl that her letters from home might be withheld as privilege for the umpteenth time in comparison to the words of friends, laughed across the room, or whispered in secret in the stillness of the night over a meal of stolen bread and cheese from the dinner table, after being banished, unfulfilled, from supper? And so it was that, on that one dismal morning in June, I passed by the windows streaked with droplets of rain against the dark sky, glowing but vaguely grey in the distance, as the sun nonetheless continued its path, unable to break through the storm clouds on my way to the office that the rectress kept at the bottom of the stairs and to the back of the fire, after being summoned, and I received a small bundle of letters, each well past their date of delivery. While you have not, as of yet, earned the privilege of outside correspondence, said the rectress, as she handed me the small bundle, containing half a dozen letters, which had been tied together with a bit of twine, expertly and exactly twisted and bowed at the top. Given the circumstances, I find it fitting that they should be passed on to you. After I had taken the letters from her hand with an uneasy curtsy, the rectress waved her hand to indicate that I might be seated, and I did my best to perch on the edge of the chair, with grace, as expected, and not to fidget with the letters in curiosity. The rectress had never before softened her hand on a punishment once delivered. We searched her face for any sign of tenderness or other outward indications that she might feel some remorse for depriving me of my only means of contact with my father, who was all the family that I had in this world. Her face was as inscrutable and impassive as ever, though, as she seated herself behind the desk, striking an ever-imposing figure as she reached for and held before her a letter. This arrived by post this morning. It is a letter from your father's estate. Though the rectress did not pause before continuing, in my memory, I can recall that space of silence between where her last sentence had ended and the next began, and the way it seemed to stretch out to an eternity, full to the brim and buzzing with horrible anticipation that clouded my mind and swirled like a haze over my eyes, now wide with the impending horror that was building up through my spine and clamping like a vice around the base of my skull. In that brief moment, no longer in time than the space between one breath and the next, the weight of a crushing and all-consuming doom coalesced in my mind, as yet undefined, by being brought to voice as it hung in the air, acrid in its writhing menace. And then the shrill, and matter-of-fact voice of the rectress unleashed its devastation by giving it life. Your father is dead. He passed last Sunday evening. Apparently, he was taken by sudden illness, a fact which you might have known had you not behaved so uproariously these last few weeks. She nodded stiffly once in the direction of my now shaking hand that held what were the last letters I would ever receive from my father. The rectress continued on for a time, and I confess I only but numbly half listened to her as she spoke, my entire being overwhelmed with the numbness that comes to dull whole senses save one, in the way of extreme emotional distress. I remember, but vaguely, the way she explained that my tuition, room and board had been provided for through until my adulthood, and that the kindly caretaker Wandsworth would assume control in my adolescence and had been appointed as guardian. You are permitted to your room for the remainder of the morning and excused from your lessons in order to collect yourself after this news. Lessons will resume after luncheon, and I expect that you display the proper conduct as befitting a lady. Arrangements will be made for you to attend the funeral. The rectress betrayed not a hint of sympathy nor concern as she told me of the first tragedy in my memory, and gave me but a short hours in which to mourn. You are excused, she said simply, and I stood stiffly and began to walk towards the door, stopping myself for a moment with an almost automatic action, and gave a wobbly curtsy before slipping out of the room. As I made my way out of her office, my focus on not shuffling my feet, which now seemed to be made of lead, I passed Lottie and Pavetti on the stairs as they made their way down for morning meal, and ignored their questions, drifting upstairs past them towards my room, as not more but a wraith of my former self. Truth be told, as I am writing here, I do not recall what I did in the span of the next few hours once I reached my room, save for placing the small bundle of letters carefully into my emptied jewellery box and moving the box to the very bottom of my trunk for safekeeping. I could not bring myself to read them. Doing so would have made it all too real, and the reality of my father's passing would soon enough be confronting me in the form of a funeral. I hung there, in a state of numbness and semi-anticipation, until the bell rang to signal the end of morning lessons, and that luncheon was about to begin. Doing little, moving less, before checking my face and clothing in the mirror to ensure that I was presentable, and then made my way downstairs to join my peers at the table. Like many things that day, the luncheon itself and the afternoon classes passed in a haze of automatic and mechanical actions, and a dull droning of speech that I could hardly process. That evening, I was bid to dress for travel and bundled off with a small suitcase containing, among a few other things, the dress that I would don to lay my late father to his final rest. For the first time in years, I was headed in the direction of home, and without the watchful eye of the rigorous rectress to follow my every action. As the carriage pulled away from the institute, my tears fell at last in a torrent of silent sobs. As I stood, a few days later, by my father's grave, Wandsworth at my side and surrounded by friends and admirers, the only words I heard were those of the rector's before I had departed. Mind your composure. Do not embarrass yourself or betray your father's last wishes that you should be a proper lady. My father had been renowned the world over for his musical talent, and there was no shortage to the number of well-wishers that offered their sympathies directly to me as I stood. Impassive and masked with a face of porcelain, just as the rectress would wear herself in all situations, and betrayed not a quivering of lip or eye. And as my father's casket was carried to the mausoleum to be locked away for all eternity, my willfulness went with him. I would have preferred to return home to the now desolate and empty estate that had been left to me, to sleep in my own bed, surrounded by comforting walls and memories of childhood. But Wandsworth, now my guardian, suggested that doing as much may well deepen the melancholy that had swept over my soul, and that it would likely be far more prudent to return to the institute, where my mind would be occupied by my studies and the company of dearest friends. There was not a word of argument from my lips, simply quiet acceptance of circumstance. It was only as I was climbing carefully into the carriage that would begin my journey back to the institute that Wandsworth, ever the devoted servant to my father and a kind, gentle man, offered me a small, leather-bound journal.
It was your father's,
he said, his pale eyes calm and gentle, his brows drawn together with the weight of his pity and concern. When we arrived back at the institute, the journal, which had remained closed, joined the little bundle of letters at the bottom of my trunk and lay, still and all but forgotten, in the next handful of years, whilst I dedicated myself to my studies, much to the pleasure of the rectress. Any fight we had within me, any mischief or chaos that I had previously sought to cause with my companions, had been sealed away beyond the wall of the mausoleum with my father's casket, and I quickly became the ideal pupil, silent save when spoken to, using only a handful of carefully chosen, pretty words when necessary, minding all the manners of a proper Victorian lady as occasion arose. In point of fact, the only passion that I might have been accused of portraying was during ballet lessons, where it was the music alone that allowed my wooden and broken spirit to take wing and sweep along the earth in a series of precisely controlled movements. The quiet, blissful smile of a ballerina painted to my face. One might reasonably say that my devotion stemmed from determination to succeed and live up to the expectations of my father or the rectress. But the more astute would bear in mind that I longed solely for the freedom that can be found when the body and mind is given over to the tempo and melody of a song, motions constructed and executed by the whispered whim of the composer as puppeteer, that brought any solace to a life left empty and wanting. My friends, ever my erstwhile companions, close as sisters, had at first been supportive and endeavoured to elicit from me any such response as was previously so easy to come by once I returned. But after months of failure, they eventually drifted from me, and the closeness of bond we once shared appeared to change, wrought within me, was one that was permanent, rather than of a temporary nature. Though we still shared meals and lessons side by side, as we ever did, as did all the pupils of the Institute, no longer did we share wild and carefree leanings of rebellious youth, nor the quiet whispers of enduring friendship. By the time when we would graduate to society as proper ladies, well versed in the arts, came, we would be but mere acquaintances of alma mater, the sort of shallow affiliation more befitting to women of our station than the closeness and devotion that a child might entertain. Indeed, my only real affections were for the rectors, whom I had come to see as a role model of sorts. The ever persistent calm in the storm, and Wandsworth, whose frequent letters with updates of home were regularly punctuated with small gifts befitting my station. Such an exceptional student had I become that, in my last years at the Institute, the rectors began to train me in the art of training others, and eventually confessed her desire that I should take up her mantle at the school when she retired, a position which I accepted without much thought, as naturally fitting as a glove to the hand. I would need, of course, to return home to my estate now that I had reached adulthood, and see to it that it was sold. Wandsworth, ever the faithful servant of the household, would of course be invited to continue his occupation at the Institute with me. And so it was that in the summer of my 19th year, the rectress and I made the journey back to the estate left to me by my father, and I stepped foot once more upon the hollowed ground of my childhood, which stood as little more than a half-remembered memory in a life we had never truly lived. Wandsworth, having been informed by letter of our imminent arrival, met us before the marble stairs that led to the door on the day that we arrived, and arranged for the bags to be brought up, and saw to it that rooms had been properly prepared. The rectress and I were meant to stay through the summer whilst overseeing the sale of the estate and possessions, as well as the packing of a few choice pieces that would accompany us on the return trip. The Institute featured 2 sets of apartments, one of which occupied the rectress in her engagement as lead of the school, whilst the other sat empty as of present, designed for one in just my position, and would be in need of furnishment, something that I certainly had no lack of. After a quiet and uneventful supper, provided for by the careful attentions of Wandsworth and the cook who had been employed solely for the summer and our stay, the rectress retired for the evening to the guest suite on the 2nd floor, and we at last had occasion to wander freely about my own home amidst the haunted memories of a youth long since past. We began outside in the front gardens, wandering amongst the rose bushes and the creeping wisteria that had somewhat overgrown, despite the attentions of Wadsworth, in the absence of a dedicated gardener. Though it had a certain natural and earthly charm in its disarray, and for a moment I imagined walking barefoot along the worn path of little stones amongst the growths. But of course, such an action was unfitting of a lady of Alanda's standing, let alone the future rectoress of the Seneste Institute. We refrained from the impulsive action and left the garden with its perfumed sense of earth and flora, making my way up the marble steps towards the heavy front doors and then into the foyer. If the garden outside was becoming wild and overgrown, the foyer betrayed no hint that the rest of the manor should become likewise. The twin banisters that led to the 2nd floor gleamed along with the floor, painstakingly polished and free of any accumulation of dirt or dust. The velvet carpeting of each step flawless. The sconces that adorned the walls free of any wax build-up from the pure white candles they held, clearly having been carefully attended. I recalled skipping through the space with delight as a child, after sliding down the banister, father's hands around my waist to ensure my safety. And for just a moment, my wistful eyes could almost see the scene play out before them as a shadow. The delight of my times with him. Whatever feelings I had that were brewing inside me then, I dutifully stuffed down into their little box, ever careful to keep my composure and myself as I should be. Calm, serene and thoughtful, betraying no hint of emotion on the outside, as my father would have wished of me, and the rectress demanded. Neither need worry any longer, for my default state was secured enough through the years of training and tragedy. I made my way to the right of the fire, passing by the large clock that sat in its wooden tower, its pendulum swinging softly, and made my way into the parlour. A small oil lamp sat on a mahogany side table near the doorway, and I lit it with the little mechanical lighter that was seated nearby for that purpose, holding it aloft in my hand before me in order to survey the room. Outside the windows, the stars were beginning to shine over the overgrown curtains as the night had become. To the back of the parlour stood a fireplace, immaculately clean from lack of use. A small wooden box resting on the mantel, and a portrait of my father looking out to the right some distance, with his cherished violin in hand, was fixed to the wall above it in its wooden frame. He had been a young man when it was painted. 25, he had said. The year he had married my mother. He did not look all that much younger than my father himself had, the last time that I had laid my eyes on him. The seeds of sorrow began to spread through me as I gazed upon his face, reflected back to me in the lamplight. And so I turned away, bringing the light to focus instead on the walls, which were lined with shelves. From my youth, I recalled them to be filled near to bursting with tomes and volumes of ever discernible size and colour of binding. But as I looked upon them now, in the glow of the lamp oil, I saw not a single book. Instead, the shelves were lined, both of the long walls beneath the windows and the fireplace were now home to an unfathomable number of dolls, each positioned exactly and with the utmost care, in dresses of every colour and style that one might imagine, and several besides that stretched the imagination to limits I have not words enough to accurately describe. Faces of the purest white porcelain adorned each doll, each head resting gently on a shoulder, positioned so that each, in its stillness, seemed to gaze with adoration upon the painting that hung in darkness above the mantel. Their black, glossy eyes reflecting the lamplight with an unsettling and unseeing gaze. There were hundreds of them, spanning different sizes. Some so small that they might rest upon a single fingertip, whilst others might well have been mistaken for young children themselves, so immense were their size. I drew closer to one of the shelves, leaning in to inspect the dolls, one by one. I had never known my father had taken to collecting them after I had gone away to study abroad. Perhaps it had been his manner of remembering his daughter in his absence, or else a gesture most kindly prepared for her eventual return. I felt it then. Not for the first time, I must reflect, but rather for the first time that such feeling was acute enough to quantify. As I surveyed the dolls, looking closely into one blank face after the next, I could feel it begin to well up in me, beginning in the pit of my stomach and spreading, slowly, its tendrils expanding and creeping up my spine like ivy, laying claim to every nerve as I passed, muscles and veins contracting in its wake. An odd sort of wet pressure began to build in the bottom of my throat as it continued to climb, and I swallowed hard against the lump that was forming there. The faces of the dolls were not immaculate, after all. This one had the faintest showings of a crack, just near its chin. And that one, a minute line that ran up below its left eye. The looming dread that was washing over me had at last reached the follicles of hair on the back of my neck, constricting tightly so that they stood up on end as my eyes stared widely, attempting in vain to understand the meaning of this. While I hadn't been able to discern any meaning or method of placement of the dolls, I saw now the horrible truth as I had followed along, shelf by shelf, back towards the fireplace. For as I drew nearer to where the stone stood empty of any warming glow or light, the porcelain face of each doll became more and more ruined than the one that preceded it. This one with a large chunk of plaster missing entirely, and that one with deep dark lines that spread across the surface like black spider webs of ruin, each more horrible and horrifying than the last. Enraptured, captured in a single moment of undefined horror, I pressed onwards, with no control to stop nor to free myself from the growing horror of this macabre scene that was playing out in front of me as the lifeless, soulless black eyes of the dolls grew larger, with each progression towards the mantel, until they were freakish in nature, and then beyond to vast gaping holes that mirrored the black, inky void of their mouths. Closer now, and their arms no longer hanging limply by their sides, but rising up and stretching out towards the mantel, towards the portrait of my father in that lamplight that had just begun to illuminate, shivering with silent anticipation on the brink of some undefined moment. closer still, and every nerve was alight with a freezing chill in the air. Every muscle coiled tightly, as though ready to spring and run for safety, against an unknown enemy in the faces. Oh, the hideous, horrible faces, no longer recognisable as porcelain faces at all, but rather misshapen, writhing black portals in likeness of something unknown, unknowable, writing and writhing and wriggling in the lamplight, like shadows come to life, and intent upon swallowing whole whatever would come into its path, even as the lamplight began to dim. And I was at the mantel now, feeling the burning eyes of the portrait, no longer focused in vagary to the right, but scowling down upon me now, in my unending horror, the scream bubbling in my throat and unable to escape, trapped between one breath as another as I shuddered violently. The world was growing darker and darker as those faces. Oh God, those soulless and formless faces turned towards myself now, with a single great shuffling sound of unison motion. And then the lamp, at last extinguished, with a violently sounded huff of air, and I was plunged into absolute darkness.